My name is Alison Whitmore. I'm 34 years old, divorced, and a mother to two boys who still believe that if you show up with something warm in your hands and hope in your chest, people will meet you halfway. We live in a small rental house just outside the city. Nothing impressive, beige walls, a yard that floods when it rains too hard. But it's quiet. After everything that unraveled between me and my family over the last few years, quiet became my version of safety. It was the one thing I could control. So when my mother's name lit up my phone 2 days before New Year's Eve, I stared at it longer than I should have. Long enough for the screen to dim, long enough to consider letting it ring out and telling myself I didn't see it. We hadn't been close for a while, and by a while I mean since my marriage ended and my family quietly decided I must have been the reason it failed. Not my ex-husband, not the years of emotional erosion. Me. My mother had always believed families needed a center of gravity, a golden child everything revolved around. In ours, that child was my younger sister, the one with the perfect career, the polished husband, the curated life that fit neatly into holiday newsletters. Meanwhile, I was the other daughter, the one who worked in IT, which to them sounded suspiciously like unemployment with a laptop, the one who stopped showing up to every barbecue, the one who didn't try as hard to be impressive anymore. I stopped trying to fit a long time ago. It hurt less that way. So when my mother answered with a voice that sounded cheerful light, even like we hadn't last spoken through clenched teeth months earlier, my stomach tightened. "Allison, sweetheart," she said, "we're doing a big New Year's thing at the house. Countdown decorations, the whole thing. Bring the boys. It'll be special." I said nothing at first, just listened to the practiced warmth in her tone and waited for the part she wasn't saying yet. There's always a part like that. "The kids would love it," she added quickly. "Sparklers, snacks, a little photo setup. It would mean a lot to your sister. And to your dad." Not to me, never to me. I should have said no. I should have invented plans, or claimed exhaustion, or protected the fragile peace we'd built. But my youngest was standing in the kitchen, pretending not to listen, and whispered, "Are we going to Grandma's? The one with the cookies?" So I said yes. And the moment I did something in me already knew I would regret it. I woke up the next morning with that heavy, disoriented feeling you get after something quietly devastating happens. The house was still. Too still. The boys were asleep on the couch where they'd finally crashed. Sometime after midnight, blankets twisted crumbs of cookies still on the coffee table. The TV screen was black, reflecting my own tired face back at me as I stood there for a moment trying to remember when disappointment had started to feel so familiar. My phone buzzed at 6:03 a.m. I frowned. No one ever called me that early. Not my parents, not my sister, not even work. For a second, a spike of panic shot through me. The boy's an emergency. Something wrong. I grabbed the phone and saw the missed call notification followed by a voicemail alert. "Grandpa." That alone made my chest tighten. My grandfather wasn't an early riser, and he definitely wasn't someone who left voicemails unless he meant to. He was old school in every sense, landlines, handwritten notes, birthdays remembered without reminders. A voicemail from him at dawn felt deliberate in a way I wasn't ready for. I sat down on the edge of the bed before I even pressed play. At first, there was just background noise, a soft shuffle, a breath drawn in slowly like he was steadying himself. "Allison, it's Grandpa." His voice came through low and a little rough. "I know it's early. I didn't want to wake the boys, but I needed to say this before I talked myself out of it." I straightened immediately, my heart thudding harder with every word. "I saw what happened last night," he continued. "I saw all of it." My fingers curled into the blanket. "You walked in smiling. The boys were so proud holding that tray like it was something important. And nobody said a word, not even your mother." There was a pause, a long one. I could hear him swallow. "I watched you stand there trying to make sense of it. I watched your boys look around like they'd done something wrong. And then I watched you leave without raising your voice, without embarrassing anyone. You just protected them." Another pause, this one heavier. "And your mother?" he said quietly. She shrugged. Like it didn't matter. Like you didn't matter. My throat burned. I hadn't cried the night before. I'd kept it together for the boys, for the drive home, for the fake countdown, and the dollar store party poppers. But hearing someone else say it out loud cracked something open. I should have said something. He went on. "Right there. I should have stood up. But I didn't. I froze. That's what we do in this family, isn't it? We stay quiet. We don't rock the boat. And that's how this kind of poison spreads." His voice shook now. "You're a good mother, Allison. A better parent than I ever was. Better than your father ever tried to be. Don't let them make you feel small. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. The voicemail ended there. No dramatic sign-off, no advice, just truth. I stared at the screen long after it went dark again. Then I played it again and again. I must have listened to it 10 times, like I was afraid the words would disappear if I didn't memorize them. It didn't undo what happened. It didn't magically heal anything, but it did something else. It named the wound. And once something is named, you can't pretend it doesn't exist. I was still sitting there when my phone buzzed again. A text from my mother. Are you upset about something? I actually laughed. A short, disbelieving sound that echoed too loudly in the quiet room. Upset about something. As if we hadn't walked into a party that had no space for us. As if my sons hadn't been treated like furniture. As if we hadn't left because staying would have meant teaching them that being invisible was normal. I didn't reply. Instead, I made breakfast. Pancakes from a box, nothing fancy. The boys wandered in, sleepy and quiet. No questions, no complaints. They ate, watched cartoons, leaned against me on the couch. I let them have cookies again, even though it was technically too early, because rules felt ridiculous after the night before. Around noon, my phone rang. My sister's name flashed across the screen. That alone told me everything. She never called unless she needed something or wanted to smooth over a mess that wasn't hers. I hesitated, then answered. Hey, I said, keeping my voice flat. Hey, she replied, too upbeat. So, what happened last night? I blinked. You were there. Yeah, but Mom said you kind of stormed out. I almost smiled at that. Stormed out. As if quietly leaving, with two confused children counted as a scene. There was nowhere to sit, I said. No one said hello. The kids were hungry, and the countdown had already happened. She sighed like I was exhausting her. Alison, you came late. People were already in party mode. You know how these things go. You told us 8. Well, yeah, but people showed up earlier. It's not like anyone was trying to exclude you. I pictured her polite nod. The way she'd looked straight at me and then away. Except when you saw us and didn't say anything, I said. Silence, just for a second. Look, she said finally. Her tone sharpening. Mom was upset. She said you made things awkward by leaving. I left so my kids wouldn't cry in front of your guests. See? This is what I mean, she snapped. You're always making everything about favoritism. You're always the victim. Something in me went cold. I showed up, I said quietly, and that was the problem. She launched into it after that, how I was too sensitive, how I read into things, how she had her own family and couldn't babysit my feelings. I let her talk, let her burn herself out. Then I hung up. Later that day, I sent my mother one text, just one. Don't worry, you won't have to pretend to include us again. She replied within minutes. I don't know what you want from me. We did our best. You're always looking for something to be offended by. I stared at that message until the words blurred. That was the moment something shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a quiet internal click. I wasn't going to argue anymore. I wasn't going to explain my pain to people committed to misunderstanding it. I wasn't going to keep swallowing it and calling it peace. I started remembering everything instead, and that I would later realize was the beginning of the end. The silence that followed stretched longer than I expected. Days passed without a single check-in. No "how are the boys?" No awkward apology. Not even my father's usual stiff New Year's text. It was like we'd slipped out of the family's peripheral vision entirely, and once they didn't have to acknowledge us, they simply didn't. I tried to tell myself that was fine. Better than pretending. Better than being invited just to fill a space no one intended to hold open. But the thing about silence is that children notice it even when adults pretend not to. It happened a few nights later after dinner. Max had come home with a drawing from school, one of those My Family assignments that teachers send home without realizing they sometimes detonate emotional landmines. He handed it to me with the kind of pride only a 7-year-old can manage, chest puffed out, eyes bright. Look, he said, I made us. The paper showed stick figures holding hands beneath a crooked sun. I smiled automatically, that practiced reflex I'd perfected over the years. That's awesome, buddy, I said. Tell me who's who. He pointed eagerly. That's you. That's me. That's Caleb. My finger traced the little cluster. And this one? That's Grandpa, he said without hesitation. The one who called. I paused. What about Grandma and your aunt? He shrugged, not dramatically. Just honestly. They didn't say hi. Something in my chest caved inward. This wasn't about my hurt anymore. This wasn't about favoritism or slights or old wounds I'd learned to tolerate. This was about my sons quietly categorizing who mattered based on how they were treated, about them learning that love was conditional and silence was normal. And I wasn't going to let that lesson stick. That weekend, I packed up the boys and drove 45 minutes to visit my grandfather. He lived in a small assisted living complex tucked behind a line of trees, the kind of place that smelled faintly like coffee and disinfectant and old books. We brought soup puzzles and the cookies he hadn't gotten to try on New Year's Eve. When he opened the door and saw the boys, his eyes went glassy instantly. He pulled them into a hug like they were something precious he'd almost lost. "I'm sorry," he said again over lunch. "I should have said something sooner." "You said it when it mattered," I told him. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded as if he'd come to a decision. "You know," he said slowly, pushing his bowl aside, "your grandmother kept a box." I froze. A box. He stood and shuffled toward his bedroom, returning a moment later with a weathered gray file box. The kind people use to store documents they don't want to throw away but can't quite part with. "She used to say, 'One day this will be Alison's,'" he said, setting it gently on the table. "She knew your mother wouldn't give it to you, so she left it with me." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were pieces of a version of my life I barely remembered. Photos of me as a kid, messy hair, gap-toothed smile, always clutching a book or my childhood dog. Old report cards. A copy of my college scholarship letter. Birthday cards in my grandmother's looping handwriting. Even checks she'd sent me during rough years, the memo line always reading, "Don't tell your mother." At the bottom was a letter. It wasn't long, just a few careful paragraphs. "Alison, I know they don't always see you, but I do. You're not loud, but you're steady. Not flashy, but kind. That matters more than anything. One day you'll build something beautiful. Remember, they don't get to decide who you are." I cried then. Not the sharp, angry crying I'd grown used to. The quiet kind. The kind that releases something you didn't realize you'd been carrying for decades. That night, after the boys were asleep, I tucked the box under my bed and opened a notebook. I didn't know exactly why. I just knew I needed to write. I wrote down everything. Every time I'd been dismissed. Every excuse. Every moment my children had been treated like afterthoughts. I wasn't plotting revenge. Not yet. I just wanted the truth laid out where I could see it clearly. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the problem. And then just days later came the moment that proved I was right. The proof didn't arrive with shouting or confrontation. It came quietly wrapped in pixels and polite language, which somehow made it worse. I was folding laundry when my phone buzzed with a Facebook notification. Normally, I ignored those. I'd muted most family posts after New Year's, tired of watching a version of togetherness that never included us. But this one slipped through before I could stop it. My sister had posted an album. "Family time," that was the caption. I hesitated before opening it, already bracing myself, already knowing. Still, some stubborn part of me hoped I was wrong. That maybe there'd be a blurry corner shot of the boys, a partial arm, proof that we had existed in that room. There wasn't. The photos rolled by one after another, my parents smiling with my sister's kids, cousins clinking glasses, a cake with Happy 2020. 226 piped neatly in silver frosting, pajamas, firelight, warmth, tradition. And then the group photo. Everyone standing in rows in front of the fireplace, arms linked, grinning like they'd nailed the concept of family. Everyone accounted for, except us. Not in the background, not cropped out, not even accidentally reflected in a mirror. It was as if we had never walked through that door at all. I scrolled to the comments, my chest tightening with every swipe. "Looks like the whole family made it," one of my mother's friends wrote. "Love seeing these traditions passed down." My mother replied beneath it. Yes, everyone was there. So much love in one room. I stared at that sentence longer than I cared to admit. Everyone was there. I set the phone down on the dryer and pressed my palms against the cool metal, breathing, slowly, deliberately. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't thoughtlessness. This was a choice, a clean public erasure. And then, as if the universe wanted to make sure I couldn't soften it later, the letter arrived. It came 2 days later in a plain envelope with an official seal. No return address I recognized at first. I almost tossed it aside with the junk mail until I saw my name typed neatly across the front. Inside was a single page, legal language, precise, cold. It informed me that my parents had updated their estate planning documents, that effective immediately, I was no longer a named beneficiary in the family trust. The wording was clinical, stripped of emotion, as if removing a daughter, and by extension her children, from a legacy was a simple administrative task. No action is required on your part. I sat at the kitchen table with that letter for nearly an hour. It wasn't about money. I hadn't expected anything. I'd never built my life around an inheritance that came with strings attached. But seeing my name removed in ink felt final in a way nothing else had. Written out. Official. Approved. My phone buzzed minutes later. A text from my mother. Please don't overreact to the lawyer stuff. It's just practical. Your sister has kids after all. It doesn't mean we don't love you. I didn't reply. What would I even say? That my kids existed too. That love you have to justify isn't love at all. That practicality seemed to always cut in the same direction. I folded the letter carefully and slid it into the notebook where I'd been recording everything. Another entry. Another line crossed. That night, after the boys were asleep, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments I'd once brushed off as minor. The jokes, the assumptions, the way I was always asked to help but never asked to stay, the way my children were tolerated, not treasured. I understood something then with startling clarity. They weren't going to change. They didn't feel cruel in their own minds. They felt reasonable, efficient, justified. And because of that, there would never be a moment where they suddenly woke up and saw me. So I stopped waiting for it. I stopped hoping for an apology that would never come, for recognition that would always arrive too late to matter. I stopped asking myself what I could have done differently. Instead, I asked a new question. What would my life look like if I built it without leaving space for them to step into whenever it suited them? The answer scared me at first. Then it steadied me. Because if they were going to write me out of their story, I was done trying to edit myself back in. I was ready to start writing something of my own. January arrived without ceremony. No resolutions, no dramatic declarations, just a quiet decision that settled into my bones and stayed there. I started by putting my own house in order, not metaphorically, but literally. I opened my laptop one morning while the boys were at school and made a spreadsheet. Every expense, every subscription I'd forgotten about, every dollar I'd spent out of habit instead of intention. I cut what didn't matter. Streamers I never watched, apps I didn't use, small leaks that added up over time. I redirected that money into a new savings account and labeled it stability. Not vacation, not fun, stability. Then I did something that felt both terrifying and overdue. I stopped being available. When my mother called asking if I could swing by to help her hang curtains as if nothing had happened, I paused before answering. I can't, I said calmly. There was a long silence on the other end. Oh, she said finally. I just thought you'd want to be included. I nearly laughed. I do, I replied. Just not like that. Then I hung up. Each boundary felt awkward at first, like wearing shoes that hadn't been broken in yet, but every time I said no, something inside me straightened, tightened, healed a fraction. With the noise dialed down, the idea that had been circling the edges of my mind finally landed. I'd spent years freelancing in IT, fixing systems, patching networks, streamlining workflows for small businesses that didn't understand what they needed until everything broke. I was good at it, quietly, consistently good. But I'd never built anything of my own because I'd always been busy holding everyone else together. So I started working at night. After the boys went to bed, I'd sit at the kitchen table with a mug of reheated coffee and sketch ideas in that same notebook where I'd written down every slight and dismissal. What if I turned all of that, the frustration, the invisibility, into something useful? What I began building was simple on the surface, a centralized dashboard for small businesses to manage IT maintenance. Tickets, updates, network status, license renewals, everything in one place. Something I'd wished existed for nearly every client I'd ever worked with. I called it Backbone, because that's what I'd always been. The support system people leaned on ignored and only noticed when it was gone. The first prototype was rough, ugly even, but it worked. In March, I launched a closed beta with 5 users, all former clients I trusted. A dentist, a tutoring center, a bakery with an almost obsessive concern for Wi-Fi speeds. They loved it. Not in a flashy way. In a, this solves a real problem way. One of them referred me to another, then another. By April, I had 27 users. By May, 60. My inbox filled faster than I could manage, and for the first time in years, exhaustion felt earned. That's when I hired help. Her name was Julia. She'd been laid off from a startup that collapsed during the New Year layoffs, sharp, efficient, and visibly tired of being underestimated. We clicked immediately. No small talk, no posturing, just competence recognizing competence. Working with her felt different than anything I'd done before. Grounded, equal, real. And somewhere in the middle of all that, the late nights, the bug fixes the small wins, I felt it. Not pride, not success. Worth, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need permission or applause. The kind that grows best when no one is watching. I stopped checking my family's social media entirely. Muted my mother's number for a while. When she texted "miss you," I didn't reply, because she didn't miss me. She missed the version of me who stayed small and convenient. Grandpa noticed the change before anyone else. "I hear you've been busy," he said one Sunday, chuckling. "One of the nurses uses your program for her cousin's bookstore." "I guess it's getting around," I said, smiling despite myself. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. I swallowed hard and said thank you. By June, the boys finished their school year. We threw a small celebration at home, balloons taped crookedly to the wall, cupcakes from the grocery store streamers that kept falling down. Julia came. Grandpa came. Max wore a paper crown. Caleb gave a speech. And for the first time, I didn't feel like we were missing anyone. We were whole. I thought that might be the end of it, that I'd quietly stepped out of the family's orbit and built something better in the space they left behind. I was wrong. Because that same month, a letter arrived that proved they weren't done trying to erase me. The letter didn't come from my parents this time. It came from a law firm. At first, I assumed it was spam, one of those official-looking envelopes designed to scare people into calling a number and handing over personal information. I set it aside on the counter and finished packing the boys' lunches before I opened it, already mentally drafting the annoyed email I'd send later. But the letterhead stopped me cold. It was real, clinical, polished, impersonal in that way only lawyers manage to perfect. The letter informed me that my parents had recently completed an update to their estate planning documents. Certain assets had been restructured, beneficiaries adjusted, long-term protections clarified. And as a courtesy, I was being notified that I was no longer named anywhere in the trust. No explanation, no discussion, no warning. Just confirmation that the erasure I'd already felt emotionally had now been finalized legally. I sat down at the table and read it again. Slowly, carefully, as if I might have misunderstood. I hadn't. My phone buzzed less than 10 minutes later. My mother. "Please don't overreact to the lawyer letter," she wrote. "It's just practical. Your sister has children. It doesn't mean we don't love you." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Practical. As if love were a limited resource and they'd simply allocated it more efficiently. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't have anything to say I had too much, but because responding would have meant I still believed this was a conversation. And it wasn't. It was a decision they'd made quietly, confidently, assuming I would swallow it the way I always had. They were wrong. That night, after the boys were asleep, I pulled out my notebook again. The one that had started as a place to unload pain and had slowly become something else entirely. I wrote one sentence at the top of a fresh page. If they can do this without telling me, what else have they done, assuming I wouldn't notice? The question lingered. And then, almost absurdly, the answer arrived on my laptop the very next afternoon. Julia had called me over to her desk, her brows drawn together in that focused way she got when something didn't quite add up. "Hey," she said, swiveling her screen toward me. "This came through our enterprise demo request." I glanced at it casually at first. Then my stomach dropped. The company name sat there in neat black letters. My sister's firm. The same private wealth group she'd spent years bragging about at holidays. The one that handled estate planning, asset management, family trusts. The one my parents had used to restructure their will. "They probably don't know it's us," I murmured. Julia raised an eyebrow. "Should they?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the screen, feeling something shift. Not anger, not satisfaction, but clarity. This wasn't coincidence. This was alignment, the kind you don't force. "Proceed like normal," I said finally. "No special treatment. No mention of me." Julia studied my face for a second, then nodded. "Got it." That night I didn't sleep much. Instead, I researched public records, press releases, industry interviews. I learned more about my sister's firm in 6 hours than I had in 6 years of listening to her talk about it. They'd expanded aggressively, acquired smaller companies, taken on estate planning as a flagship service, including my parents. Which meant my sister hadn't just benefited from the decision to remove me. She'd been professionally adjacent to it. I wasn't ready to accuse anyone of anything. I didn't need to. But for the first time, I understood something important. This wasn't just emotional neglect. This was calculated comfort. They had rewritten the story so thoroughly that they no longer saw me as someone who needed to be consulted. I was a variable they'd already solved for. And now, unknowingly, they were asking me to support the very structure that had erased me. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. The next morning, I called an old college friend who'd gone into law. We met for coffee later that week. I'm not looking to sue, I told him honestly. I just want to understand what this means. He read the letter carefully, frowning. You were a named beneficiary, he asked. Yes. And you weren't notified until after the fact? Yes. He leaned back. That's sloppy. Not illegal necessarily, but not clean either, especially if one of the trust advisors is related to the remaining beneficiary. I felt a chill run down my spine. So what are my options? I asked. He hesitated. You could challenge the process, force disclosure, make it uncomfortable. I nodded slowly. I didn't want their money, but I wanted them to know that erasing me came with risk. That night I called Grandpa and told him everything. He listened quietly, then said, They think they buried you, Alison, but they planted a seed instead. I smiled. He was right, because while they were busy cutting me out, I was building something they couldn't ignore. And soon, whether they wanted to or not, they were going to have to look straight at it. I didn't confront anyone right away. That surprised even me. If this had happened a year earlier, I would have fired off messages I'd later regret. I would have demanded explanations, clarity, acknowledgement, anything to feel like I still mattered in a system that had clearly moved on without me. But something had changed. The anger was still there, yes, but it had matured into something far more useful. Patience. Instead of reacting, I started planning. Backbone had just crossed its 1-year mark, quietly but decisively. What began as a sketch in the back of my notebook had turned into something solid, over 200 paying clients, a growing team, and the first real sense that this wasn't just a side project anymore. It was a company, one that people relied on, one that existed because I stopped asking for permission to take up space. Julia suggested we do something to mark the milestone. Nothing flashy, she said, just intentional. A thank you. For the people who believed in this early. That word stuck with me. Intentional. So I booked a small rooftop venue downtown. Clean lines, soft lighting, string lights instead of chandeliers. It wasn't extravagant, but it was thoughtful, the opposite of the half-hearted invitations I'd spent years accepting out of obligation. We sent out invites 3 weeks in advance, a simple email. Backbone 1 year in, a thank you gathering. It went to clients, mentors, early supporters, a few friends. People who showed up without needing to be reminded why they should care. And then deliberately, I added a few more names. My mother, my father, my sister, Aunt Lisa, the one who still introduced me as the one who does computer stuff, even my cousin who hadn't bothered to offer my boys a chair on New Year's Eve. I didn't expect them to come. That wasn't the point. The point was that for once I was extending the invitation not from a place of need, but from a place of record. I wanted it documented, visible, undeniable. I wanted them to see that I was no longer waiting in the margins of someone else's celebration. The night of the event, the boys were buzzing with energy. Max had insisted on helping hand out name tags. Caleb volunteered to manage the iPad for email signups, like he was running a Fortune 500 check-in desk. They wore matching suits, nothing stiff or showy, just warm and confident. And people noticed them. Not politely, genuinely. They knelt down to their level, asked their names, thanked them for helping, treated them like they belonged in the room. I watched it all from a few steps back, something tight easing in my chest. This was the table I'd been building. Julia handled most of the logistics like the COO she'd grown into, moving through the space with quiet authority. The slideshow looped in the background, early screenshots of Backbone photos from our first shared workspace growth metrics client quotes. It wasn't bragging, it was documentation. By 7:30, the space was full. Conversations layered over soft music. Glasses clinked. Laughter rose and settled like a tide. At 7:45, Julia caught my eye and tilted her head toward the elevator. They came, she murmured. I turned. My mother stepped out first, clutching her handbag like a lifeline, eyes darting around the room. My father followed, stiff and quiet hands, folded like he was attending a meeting instead of a celebration. My sister arrived moments later, phone in hand, scanning the space, with an expression I couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or recalculation. I walked over before they could decide whether to approach me. Glad you made it, I said evenly. My mother smiled too quickly. It's nice. It is, I agreed. We made small talk the hollow kind. Comments about the view, the crowd, the food. My father asked how the business really made money. My sister asked about security integrations, her tone casual, but her eyes sharp. I answered politely, briefly. Then let the silences stretch. I didn't need them impressed. I needed them present. At 8:15, I took the microphone. The room quieted naturally, not because anyone demanded it, but because they were already listening. Thank you all for being here, I began. A year ago, Backbone was just an idea, one born out of frustration, late nights, and a lifetime of being underestimated. A ripple of soft laughter moved through the crowd. I built it because I was tired of feeling like the backup plan, like support staff in my own life. And then I realized maybe that's exactly what the world needed. A support system that doesn't disappear when things get uncomfortable. I paused, scanning the room. My mother shifted. My sister crossed her arms. So tonight isn't just a celebration, I continued. It's a reminder. Being overlooked isn't a curse. Sometimes it's a cocoon. I clicked the remote in my hand. The screen behind me changed, and the room went very still. The photo filled the screen behind me, grainy but unmistakable. New Year's Eve. Caleb standing near the front door. Clip-on tie, slightly crooked, holding the tray of cookies with both hands, like it mattered. Max beside him, small fingers wrapped around mine. In the background, my mother laughing with guests, my sister mid-conversation, glass raised. Warm light, closed circle. A murmur rippled through the room. I didn't rush to explain it. I let the silence do the work. That night, I said calmly, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. My kids and I walked into a room we weren't meant to stay in. No one yelled. No one was overtly cruel. We were just invisible. I clicked again. The image shifted to the earliest version of Backbone's dashboard. Clunky. Bare bones. Then another click, our first shared workspace. Another, the podcast cover art. Growth metrics. Client testimonials. Each slide moved forward like a heartbeat. I stopped asking for a seat, I continued, and started building a table. Another click. A screenshot appeared, our enterprise client list. Names blurred, except one at the top. Whitestone Strategic Holdings. My sister's firm. I didn't look at her immediately. I kept my gaze forward. For those who don't know, I said evenly, Whitestone recently partnered with us to streamline their internal systems. Estate planning, asset management, client reporting. A few heads turned. My sister's posture stiffened. I clicked again. An email chain appeared. Julia's name. Jenna, the assistant. Subject line, onboarding. Complete. My closing line highlighted in yellow. Happy to support family-run firms. I finally looked at my sister. Still using the software, right? Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in my life, she looked genuinely unsure of herself. You knew, she asked quietly. I built it. The room stayed quiet, not awkward, not hostile, just attentive, witnessing. One last thing, I said. Click. The final image appeared. My sons dressed in their little suits, standing in our living room, holding a handmade sign. We're not invisible. Applause started slowly, not thunderous, not performative, real. The kind that rises because people understand exactly what they're clapping for. I stepped away from the microphone. Later, as the crowd thinned and the music softened, my sister cornered me near the elevator. You made your point, she said, arms crossed tightly. But that was a little dramatic, don't you think? I tilted my head. Dramatic. You didn't have to do all that. The public reveal. It felt petty. Petty, I repeated calmly. Like removing someone from a family trust without a conversation. Her jaw tightened. That was Dad's decision. Of course, I said. You were just adjacent. She scoffed. You were always doing your own thing. No one was trying to cut you out. I leaned in just enough for only her to hear me. That's the difference between us, I said quietly. You built your life to impress. I built mine to last. I walked away before she could respond. Near the valet stand, my mother waited. Her eyes were glassy, her confidence gone. I didn't know, she whispered. Not really. You didn't want to, I replied gently. She flinched. I see you now. I shook my head. No, you noticed me. There's a difference. She looked down, and for once I didn't feel the urge to comfort her. I didn't stay long after that. The boys were already asleep in the car, faces soft, peaceful. Julia had offered to handle the rest. As I drove away, city lights reflecting off the windshield, I glanced at my sons in the rearview mirror, then at the building behind us. The one I'd filled, the one I'd built. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had anything to prove. They tried to write me out, so I wrote my own story. And this time I kept the pen. I slept better that night than I had in years. Not because everything was resolved, it wasn't. Not because wounds had magically closed or relationships had been repaired, but because something far more important had finally happened. The weight had shifted. For so long, I'd carried the quiet responsibility of being the reasonable one, the forgiving one, the daughter who didn't make things difficult. I'd mistaken endurance for strength and silence for maturity. I'd told myself that if I just stayed calm, stayed useful, stayed small, eventually someone would notice. But driving home from that rooftop with my sons breathing softly in the back seat, I understood the truth with absolute clarity. I was never invisible. I was just surrounded by people who benefited from pretending I was. The days after the event were strangely quiet. No angry messages, no dramatic fallout. My father didn't call. My sister didn't text. My mother sent one short message, "I hope we can talk soon," and for the first time, I didn't feel pressured to respond on anyone else's timeline. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger still flared sometimes. Yes, especially when I thought about the trust, the years of dismissal, the way my children had learned to lower their expectations without even realizing it. But it no longer ruled me. It no longer decided my next move. Backbone kept growing. New clients came in weekly. The enterprise partnership expanded. Julia hired another developer and moved us into a larger office space with windows that let the morning light spill across our desks. The boys started stopping by after school, sometimes doing homework in the break room, proudly telling anyone who asked, "This is our mom's company." And people listened. One Sunday afternoon, Grandpa called me. "I heard your mother's been asking about you," he said gently. I smiled faintly. I figured. "Are you going to see her?" Maybe I said honestly, "One day, just not because I'm supposed to." He chuckled softly. "Your grandmother would be proud." That meant more to me than any apology ever could. Months later, when the holidays came around again, there was no invitation from my parents, no forced cheer, no performative togetherness. And for the first time, that absence didn't feel like rejection. It felt like peace. We spent New Year's Eve at home, just the three of us. Homemade pizza, board games. Max insisted on wearing a suit jacket with pajama pants. Caleb made a countdown sign out of construction paper. When midnight came, we clinked glasses of sparkling cider and laughed. And not once did any of us wonder if someone else wished we were there. Because I finally understood something I wish I'd learned sooner. You don't heal by being invited back into rooms that taught you how to disappear. You heal by building places where you and your children are never asked to shrink in the first place. They tried to write me out quietly, but I didn't fight them with rage. I didn't beg for acknowledgement. I didn't chase their approval. I built something solid. I told the truth. I showed my sons what dignity looks like when it doesn't ask for permission. And in the end, that was the only legacy that mattered.